Professor James Heckman, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. A very warm welcome to the 8th CUHK Distinguished Lecture on Global Economics and Finance, co-organized by CUHK Institute of Global Economics and Finance and Department of Economics here at CUHK. Today, we are very honored to have Professor James Heckman, Nobel laureate in economic sciences in the year 2000 and distinguished professor at large of CUHK, to deliver his lecture titled Building Life Relevant Skills, Theory and Evidence from China and the World. But before we begin, I would like to invite Professor Terence Chong, Executive Director of CUHK Institute of Global Economics and Finance, to deliver a welcome speech on behalf of the organizers. Professor Chong, please.
Professor James Heckman, distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. On behalf of CUHK Institute of Global Economics and Finance, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 8th CUHK Distinguished Lecture on Global Economics and Finance. CUHK Distinguished Lecture on Global Economics and Finance was launched in 2013. The purpose of this lecture series is to enhance the public understanding of current topics in economics and finance, with particular emphasis on the state of the global and Chinese economies. This year, we are very glad to have Department of Economics of CUHK as our co-organizer. We would like to thank the support given by the Department of Economics and other units of the university to make this event possible. Today, we are very honored to have Professor James Heckman as a speaker of the CUHK lecture. Professor James Heckman is the Henry Schultz Distinguished Service Professor in Economics at the college, an affiliate professor at the University of Chicago Harris School of Public Policy, and the director of the Center for Social Program Evaluation at Harris. Much of his work has focused on the impact of different social programs and the methodologies used to measure those programs' effects. Professor Heckman has researched areas such as education, job training programs, minimum wage legislation, women's work and earnings, child care effects, anti-discrimination laws, civil rights, and early childhood interventions. Professor Heckman was editor of the Journal of Political Economy from 1982 to 1987, and also from 2011 to 2021. He was president of the Midwest Economics Association in 1998 and president of Western Economic Association from 2006 to 2007. Professor Heckman is a fellow of the Econometric Society and the American Academy of Arts and Science, an elected member of the National Academy of Science. He's also a fellow of the American Statistical Association, the International Statistical Institute, the Journal of Econometrics, the Society of Labor Economics, and the American Association for Advancement of Science. He is also a lifetime member of the Irish Economic Association. Professor Heckman has received numerous honors, including the Joint Base Club Medal from the American Economic Association in 1983. In 2000, Professor Heckman was awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Science for his development of theory and methods for analyzing selective samples and the evaluation of public policy. Professor Heckman also received the Mincer Award for Lifetime Achievement from Society of Labor Economics in 2005. In 2008, he was awarded the Gold Medal of the President of the Italian Republic by the International Scientific Committee of Pio Manju Center. He also received the Distinguished Contributions to Public Policy for Children Award from Society for Research in Child Development in 2009. Professor Heckman was conferred an honorary Doctor of Social Science degree by CUHK in June 2024. He joined CUHK and CUHK Shenzhen as a distinguished professor at large in July 2024.
As a token of appreciation, we have prepared a souvenir for Professor Heckman. I would like to invite Professor Chong to present the souvenir to Professor Heckman on behalf of the organizers. Professor Heckman, please. Thank you. Please remain on the stage for a group photo. On this special occasion, may I also invite Acting Provost of CUHK, Professor Isabella Poon, Pro-Vice Chancellor of CUHK, Professor Chen Wei-yi, Chairman of the Management Committee of Lau Chor Tak Institute of Global Economics and Finance, Professor Zhou Lin, and also representatives from our institute, Professor Lawrence Lau, and also Professor Liu Pak Wai to come forward for a group photo, please. Thank you very much. Professor Heckman, please remain on the stage. Other distinguished guests, please be seated. Okay, so now without further ado, I will now pass the time to Professor Heckman for his lecture, Building Life Relevant Skills, Theory and Evidence from China and the World. Once again, please join me to welcome Professor Heckman.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the introduction. You shouldn't give me such special attention, though, because I'm part of the hired help. I should. I'm not a visitor. I'm an employee, so you can treat people. You can treat people in a different way. Originally, about a month ago, I was planning to talk about the evolution, the evolving relationship between the United States and China, and looking at both education and the economy. However, as many of you know, looking at the newspapers in the last month or so, the evolution is rather radical and dramatic, and it's totally unpredictable. So I gave up that topic very quickly, and I kindly was allowed out of that topic back to something a little less sexy in some sense, but maybe also of some interest. So what I want to talk about is work that I've been doing here in China, and also work I'm doing here at the Chinese University, and work that links to other parts of the research agenda of China. I mean, especially the China Development Research Foundation, the work of Lu Mai and so forth. And I'll talk a little bit about the work that we've done together. But the goal of this research is to try to think about skill formation. And you think about a modern economy, one thing we've learned is that skills are fundamental. And what we've come to understand is that the skills that matter are a lot richer than the skills that we used to think, much higher dimension. There are many more skills that matter, and building those skills represents a challenge, but also something we had to have more understanding about in the last 20 or 30 years. And so there are a lot of characteristics, which I'll define in a minute, traits and so forth. But things that we thought before that were somehow fixed at birth or immutable, things like IQ and certain personality traits, one thing we've learned is that basically through the course of education and through interaction and involvement, these skills can be built. And from a large body of evidence, we've learned that social and psychological skills that we previously kind of dismissed as being off to the side play a very fundamental role in the modern economy. And in fact, there's been a very close relationship between psychology and economics in the sense of what sometimes the psychologists call executive functioning. Economists would think about this as the ability to deal with complexity and change. And in fact, one thing we've learned is how to measure that and also how to produce it. We have a number of interventions that actually are constructive. And that is something that is fundamental in any society for thinking about dealing with change. And of course, it's trite to say the only thing we know for sure is that certainly it's not going to be what we know today is going to be different tomorrow. But change is rapid, and as every indication, it's accelerating. So this ability to deal with change and the ability to build these skills and to understand how an education system, I would say a learning system, more than just an education system, can be developed, I think is relevant to understanding how to deal with certain questions in the Chinese economy that I'll talk about today, but also to talk about aspects of not just economic productivity, but having to do with inequality and social mobility. So I'll show you some evidence on that. So what I'll do today is draw together some studies, and studies I'm conducting now here. So it's not that this is old work. Some of it is, but a lot of it is new work, and it's old work that's getting refined. So let me just give you a few familiar facts, things that are just to frame the kind of question that I'm working on. And the question that I'm really going to focus on, we know that in China, and in the rest of the world, actually, population decline is the rule. I mean, the only countries that are really growing are in Africa. I was amazed to see how in even rural India, fertility has fallen. But certainly in China, the fertility has fallen dramatically, and it has big consequences. And so as a result, dependency is growing, not just in China. Of course, in Japan, it's even more dramatic. South Korea, very dramatic, but in many other countries in the world as well. And so if you just look at the population pyramid, you can see a tremendous change in the base. If you go back to 1990 on the left-hand side of this figure, you can see a pretty fat base that really supports the retirement and support for old age and for the older age workers. But if you look now at China, for example, in 2020, in the most recent statistics that I could find, you can see that the pyramid has changed a lot. It's become kind of more like a violin shape, and it's really suggesting potential problems down the road for both men and for women, and for the growth of the economy. So I'm going to just address that question because we can think about building skills as an alternative to building and having bodies. China's success came, I think, in the last 40 or 50 years when it opened up markets. And there was a highly educated, or not highly educated, there was a medium skill educated workforce. That was a result, really, of the communist revolution, that you had a lot of people who were educated at school level. You would think of as something like primary school and also middle school skills, medium level skills. And so when capital came into the country and the saving was applied constructively, this educated workforce played a very powerful role, and it helped in the development of the Chinese economy as we know it today. But increasingly, as we move forward and we think about this shrinking population base, we're going to need, and when we think about the changing technologies that are really true everywhere around the world, that skills, more skill than just medium level skills, are going to play a fundamental role. And so, in fact, one country that shares some of China's problems in this regard would be Germany. Germany has a very medium level skill force, very important in terms of its apprenticeship programs, but also not so highly educated and not as adaptable as other workforces. So today I'm going to talk about how we might build such a workforce and how to allow China to transition to more productive technologies. So now the growth that China has experienced has produced some really interesting questions. We know people worry about income inequality, but the first order fact in China is just the whole shift of the distribution to the right. So it's true that there may be more inequality, but the level of poverty has gone down tremendously. So that's something that has to be recognized as a major achievement. So when we talk about inequality, I don't want to argue that we're talking about poverty in the same notion. Poverty has gone down and will continue to go down. But there's still inequality, and this inequality threatens the growth, I think, of China going forward. So for example, here's an example of the GDP and the growth. The GDP per capita has grown tremendously. Of course, this can be computed in different ways, and Larry may have some objections with the figures that I'm using here. I've tried to use the official statistics, but maybe they're inadequate. But we've also seen a growth in the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of inequality in the society. And this is a measure, too, that suggests there may be some major tensions in the larger society. As there are more haves as opposed to have-nots, but the have-nots are not as desperate as they were 50 years ago. We've also seen a rapid, but less rapid than maybe could be optimal, decline in the rural population. The urban population is growing, but it was really only about 10 years ago or so that the urban population expanded relative to the rural population. And the urban-rural gap is going to play a major role in what I'm talking about today. So now if you look at measures of inequality, what we're going to see is that the rural Gini is bigger and has grown, and the urban Gini has also grown, but it's smaller. So not only is there gap in the regional income differences, which is well documented, but also there's more inequality growth in the area of rural China. So this is something else which potentially creates social problems. And there's a counterpart in terms of rural-urban disparity. I don't want to beat these statistics to death, but not surprisingly, there's a huge gap east and west, and it's even growing today if you look at the income gaps. And the other gaps in the other regions, coast and middle, less dramatic. So these regional imbalances are playing a major role, I think, going forward in creating the workforce for the future Chinese economy. And let me talk a little bit about this. I know it's received a lot of attention, and I'm not making a criticism because I'm going to end up with some ideas, constructive ideas that are actually being implemented today in China about how to address these. So, but the one thing we need to understand, and when you think about building skills, and this is something that many people don't think about, a lot of public policy focuses on schools. You say, okay, if you look at the World Bank, UNESCO, you look at the IMF, many major institutions, governmental institutions around the world, they'll focus a lot on increasing education. And they mean more bricks and mortar schools, more people going to college, more people going to graduate high school, and so forth. And the notion is more about teachers and students and buildings and so forth. But what we've come to understand, and this is a very important finding, is the role of the family. And it plays a different role in different countries. It's more dramatic, actually, in the United States, but it still plays an important role here. And you can see the role of the family, and especially when we compare rural and urban families. So for example, if we look at these data are a little bit out of, this is the recent data, most recent data I could find. But for example, if we look at kind of family economic conditions, we can actually see that in the rural areas, children are much worse off by many different measures. If you look at aspects of things like flush toilets, having a father with a high school education, mother with a high school education, we typically find that the family environments are richer in the rural, in the urban areas. And by the measures of poverty, and those are inevitably controversial, there's still a greater poverty in the rural area. And what we also see is some major gap. Now this is closing. This figure is obsolete, actually. Some of the most recent data that I had, this is the file that I got from CDRF and used DeepSeek to translate, actually. So actually, looking at DeepSeek data, I couldn't really get the graph in on time, but it's a little better. Things have improved in this regard. But what you can see is that in terms of producing even high school graduates, and certainly graduates going on to college, that the rural-urban gap is substantial. And this is true even of 214. Now, this is closing, but has a long way to go. And so this is something that really concerns me and is going to be part of what my talking is about today. And also what we've seen, because of the way the rural areas, so the rural population is declining, and what we see is the number of primary schools is declining, especially in rural areas, because the population is declining. And of course, the number of children in each of these areas. So it's a combination of the demographic decline and then just out-migration and urbanization. But what this has led to is that the school enrollment ratios are very different in the rural areas and in the And so we can see for China as a whole, the school enrollment rate in primary school is virtually 100%. People are going to school. You're getting a lot of graduates. And it's also the case there's a very high transition rate of primary to middle school. So people are going in middle school to high school. But there still is some lag, especially in the rural areas, about moving from high school to college. And again, as part of this out-migration process, what we see is the primary school class size is actually growing. So as a measure of school quality in rural areas, there's been a decline. This is a measure that many people who study the economics of education will worry about, in the sense that when class sizes go up, the amount of individual attention that students will get. Now, this is in primary school, but this really does challenge the nature of the educational system for the people in the earliest years of their lives. Now, what the consequence of this is real, and we can measure this, and it has been measured. And these statistics have been out in the public domain, so I don't want to claim invention of any of these. But you can see some dramatic differences in things like math scores and a variety of scores, knowledge of Chinese, knowledge of a number of other measures that we think about achievement. And for example, even if we look at things like personality traits, which usually aren't considered much by economists and not considered much in thinking about skills in the economy, but have turned out to be very crucial. As we've seen, studied these skills and look at their role in the modern economy. For example, the ability, social skills play a huge role. The ability to work and form coalitions, to work in a cooperative way in the workplace, and to have a sense of the future and self-esteem. These things play very important roles in wages, in productivity, and in terms of even productivity in the firm, but certainly in terms of life advancement. And there are gaps between the rural and urban children that are substantial. So we know that migration has a huge issue, created a lot of problems. And this, again, I don't want to bore you with familiar review of problems, because I'll move beyond this review, but I want to set the stage for what we're doing. And so when we think about the problem of left behind children, we know that it's massive. A lot of left behind children. A total in 2015, the estimate was close to 100 million, 95.6 million. Now, the composition of these, 64.7% of the children were living with both parents, but there were a lot of people whose parents moved east and left their parents, left the children behind. We are doing a systematic study of these children. We have another study that I'll talk a little bit about on a group of children in Mianzhu, and we followed these children from the earliest years, about third or fourth grade, now into college. So we have longitudinal data on these people. And what we've seen is how well the children who are left behind. So many of those children are left behind, some are not. We can study things like remittances that are paid to these people. So the parents leave, frequently the mother leaves or the father. You can see that there is a lot of cases where both are leaving. But true, a lot of children are being raised by grandparents. And it turns out that the grandparents have much less level of education than the parents. And that plays a big role and has a very negative effect in terms of the development on these skills. So what our goal is to try to understand what effective policies there might be. Now, some part of this is policy that's being corrected. The reason why these children are left behind has to do with the policy of CUHK and Lotus, how people are being assimilated. Migrants into urban areas are being assimilated. And the very strict requirements are gradually being eliminated. But not the major cities, not the places like Shanghai and Beijing and Chongqing and so forth. And so there still remains a very substantial problem that children are being separated from their parents. Now, it's not that they're permanently separated. And in the data that we measure, we can actually follow what the family ties are. A lot of the children are actually getting support. Their remittances sent from people working on the East. And we can ask the question, which we have in the Mianzhu study, is how well these remittances compensate for the lack of parental time. So what's the substitutability between money and time in terms of child outcomes? And we can see that the substitution rate is pretty poor. That literally parental presence plays a major role. That's something I want to emphasize. It's not something we usually think about. When you think about statistics on the economy, we don't really talk about dimensions of family life. In my own country, in the United States, there's a very different kind of problem, where we have a lot of broken families, like in the African American population. In Chicago, where I live, about 80% of the children are born out of wedlock. And a lot of these children, the average level of knowledge of high school and even preschool, primary school children, if you think about a national average, we'll see about maybe 10 or 15% of those kids are at national norms. So whatever the problem is, it's exacerbated. The quality of the schools are low and so forth. But a big part of it is that the family support of the school is actually very seriously compromised, and because the families are compromised. There are a lot of single parents. The single parents are really very poor in general. They don't receive a lot of support. The children do receive as much support as the parents give. I'm not castigating anybody, but the fact of the matter is that they do receive a much more impoverished environment. And it turns out those environments are playing a crucial role in building these skills, and I'll try to show you. So this notion of the family is a central part. We don't think about family policy in the same way we think about investment policy, but it's very important. And in fact, in building skills, I think it's crucial. So just some other data, some background data before I get to the notion of what we might address these problems. We can see what the educational status of youth is in this critical age between leaving secondary school and maybe going on to college. We can see that intact families, there are a lot of children who are going on, graduating high school, and many going on to college. But if you look down the rows of this, you can see that the single parent child and so forth very rarely goes to college. You can see that a lot of these are not even in school. These are the children that are not in school, they're not employed in many cases, and they represent a group of people who are substantial, and they represent a substantial future problem for the society. So what I really want to say is that the family environments are compromised. I just showed you what they are. And the question is, what can we do about it? Now, I don't want to start pontificating about Chinese educational policy. I have in other studies looked at this issue, and you can certainly look at the way that regional funding for education is maintained. There are vast gaps between some of the poorest and the richest provinces. So for example, in Beijing or in Shenzhen, students are getting a pretty high level of support from the government, the local provincial government. But in some of the provinces out in the West, not so good. And it really leads to substantial differences. So that's something that can be addressed and is being addressed, and I'm not going to talk about it anymore unless it comes up in discussion. But there is a lot of work addressing it, and the government is fully aware of that. And the China Development Research Group has put out a lot of policy position papers looking at that. What I'm more interested in today, and I have some data on it, we have both theoretical models and also a lot of interesting data about policies to build life-relevant skills. And so, although the level of the nature of the disadvantage may be different in different parts of the world. So for example, if you look at some places in Africa, or if you look at places in China, the problem is different. The left behind children problem is different than, for example, the problem of broken families in the US. So I don't want to suggest that these are the same problems. But the issues are similar in the sense that parenting is in short supply. And we tend to think that parenting is not so important. We don't think about it. There was a famous study done in the US in the 1960s of a sociologist, my colleague actually at one time, James Coleman, wrote a report called the Coleman Report. And this was written at a time when the Great Society was being unfolded in the US, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. And the question was really how much educational gap there was. How much did the educational gaps, say, between blacks and whites, between rural and urban in the United States, depend on schooling expenditure. And the amazing thing that came out of that study was that literally there was very little role of these schooling expenditure gaps, even though there were huge gaps between North and the South. The only exception, there was one group. Black and white gaps did play a role. They did play because they were so pronounced. But generally speaking, it turned out that it was much more the family and the family environments that explained child achievement gaps than actually the amount of money spent on schools. That's been found in many, many countries, but people don't want to think about it. We think about education, we kind of put the family and we treat it like a separate matter and keep it off to the side. But I want to argue we should really think about integrating it much more. So I want to talk about skills-based policies. So let me tell you how skills are formed and why we want to think more broadly about family policy and about thinking about how learning should be encouraged instead of just education. Education, we think about teachers lecturing a group of students. It's kind of very, very formalized, a very formal kind of structure. But what you really want to consider is the way that skills form over the life cycle. And here we have a lot of knowledge. It's growing knowledge. It's knowledge that's actually been around for many years. And I'll talk about studies that were launched 60 years ago, where we have follow-ups from those studies, and we can see how these early interventions played a big role. But we can argue something that we didn't recognize is how skills were formed. And this plays a role even in the way that the left-behind children are being treated. It's an odd, well, I'll show you in a minute what I mean by this. Skill gaps open up very early. And this is something we didn't really appreciate until about 20 or 30 years ago. So this is the case we're getting advantage, longitudinal data, measuring these skills on children, measuring these skills and how they emerge over the life cycle plays a very important role. But there's something very important to keep in mind, and people don't think about it in this way. And it's not usually thought of as part of government policy or some part of an educational policy. But each of these skills, whether they're social, psychological skills, things like IQ, each of these is not set in stone. I'll show you some examples where IQ can actually be fostered. You can see traumatic gains in IQ among very disadvantaged children. You can also see where certain interventions in family life break the cycle across generations about education and poverty, so that we can actually think more constructively than we have in the past. So really the beginning, and this is something that a lot of neuroscience has been addressed, people have probably heard about versions of this, about the early years being very important and the brain developing so rapidly at early ages. But it's not something that still has played as important a role as it should in public policy. And I'll even talk about how to learn Chinese and certainly how to learn English if you're in China. Let me just show you some example. There's a version of this for Hong Kong, and I swear to God I had it and I couldn't find it. So I'm sorry, this is US data. What it does is it shows an achievement score. Now it's achievement score by age of the child. And it follows children from the earliest years that we can credibly measure it, age 3, to, there are things called IQ for younger children, but they're not very meaningful. But we can measure it up to, say, 18. So I stop at 18 because that's the time we think about children entering college, entering the workforce, and standing on their own 2 feet. What you can see in the US data is pretty amazing. So you can see that children of mothers who are college graduates have very high achievement scores. That's true at age 3 and it's true at age 18. And if you go down the educational profile from high school graduates down to dropouts, you can see that the achievement test scores of children continuously decline. So there really is an important role of family influence. And this study has been replicated in many countries around the world. As I say, it's been found in Hong Kong. So maybe somebody here has actually done such a study. I'd like to get it back again because I couldn't find it. I used to have a slide on it, but I don't have it. But nonetheless, it's found in many countries, Colombia, in India, And many countries where this is found, versions of this. But the reason why this is interesting is not only are the gaps substantial, but this is US data. And if you look at the US data, you can see, and we know, that there's a tremendous gap in educational quality. There's a lot of sorting. So highly educated mothers are typically living in areas with good schools. They're usually two-parent families. They're living in better environments with better peers. All of that's true, but none of that seems to be changing the central gap. Now, you got to be careful. I mean, these are test scores, and you can transform test scores arbitrarily. But the point is, given the way we ordinarily report test scores, what you're seeing is that these gaps are really not that much affected by the change in environment. It's not really showing up in the way that I'd expect. You might think that there was a worsening at the bottom. So that's one, and there are many, many studies on this. There's a recent replication of this and so forth. So what a lot of us have been working on is the notion of trying to look at this knowledge about skills and think about how we can develop policies that will allow us to capitalize on what we know about how skills are formed. So let me just give you two key observations. And this is something that I think is really important in China, but it's true everywhere. You really have to think about skills as a vector. There are many skills. And these skills are all important. And how do I know they're important? Because we've done a number of studies where you look at things like wages that are achieved in later life, accomplishments, occupational attainment, participation in higher levels of education, creativity as measured by the ability to make inventions and so forth and so on. These skills are all very, very important. And the reason why I mention that is I know that in China, I think it's still true today, the PISA scores still have a central role. Maybe they don't anymore. Is that true? Has there been a de-emphasis of PISA? I know that people are very proud that the Shanghai PISA scores are leading the world. However, what I should point out, there are many other skills that are highly relevant, and we've learned that. And that's one of the findings that's emerged in the last 20 or 30 years. And when I say they're relevant, it's not just that we have some psychological measures. We take those measures and we look at things like productivity at the firm. We look at things like wages that people are earning. We look at things having to do with unemployment in life. We look at wages and advancement in many different dimensions. And so this multiplicity is very, very important. And the other thing that we've learned tremendously is the importance of the early years. And this is where we've learned a lot from neuroscience. And there's a lot of study, I know out in the popular press, a lot of this knowledge is out there. You talk to taxi drivers in New York and they tell me the importance of the early years. So I'm not telling you anything that isn't pretty well known. But what I am telling you is a way to act on that information in a way that can be very fruitful. So the question would then be, is it effective to think about these skills early on? Or there's another approach to tackling social problems, and that is to only tackle the problem as it arises. So you think about health. I'm going to show you that some of these early interventions have a very strong role in promoting healthy lives. So when we look at children in the middle 30s, not children anymore, adults who receive these interventions I'm going to describe, that if you look at these children in their mid-30s, they're healthier on many different dimensions. And there are many other ways in which we can measure this. And by the way, these are interventions that are not health interventions. It's not like we're giving them anything particular. They're not exercise interventions. They're not interventions telling them, to eat the right foods or something of the sort. These are interventions that are designed, which I'll describe what these interventions are. They look like they're totally unrelated. So the reason I want to say this is that one strategy, social strategy, is to say, solve a problem as it arises. And that's effective in some way. I mean, we don't want to solve problems that are not going to occur at any, so that's certainly effective. So we have a crime problem, we have more police, we have health problems, we build more hospitals, and so forth and so on. However, I do want to argue that we have a much better understanding of how these problems. So in the US, we have this phrase, should the squeaky wheel get the grease? is the problem, only the problem that shows up, the one that we should target. And the real question is whether or not these early interventions are efficient. And that's a serious question. We could target, we might be able with an intervention to be able to target some kind of rare cancer, even at the earliest age. But it may be so rare that it would be completely ineffective to target children in a broad-based way. So what I want to argue is we do know some evidence on the effectiveness. And there's been a lot of studies of this. And I'll draw on one that I find particularly compelling, but it's not the only one of its kind. There's some work by some psychologists and, I would say psychologists and epidemiologists as a group in using a New Zealand cohort. It's not an experiment, but it follows a group of children, and these are all children of European origins in New Zealand, from the age when they're born into their middle 40s. So we have lifetime longitudinal data. And they come up with a principle they call the Pareto principle. Pareto, the great economist, came up with a rule which turns out to be vindicated in New Zealand. And so the rule was that 80% of any problem is really due to 20% or rises in 20% of the population. But let me show you in particular, and this is a paper from Nature Human Behavior. So this is the Pareto principle. So the question is, if you identify a high-risk, high-need group of people, and these are things having to do with skills that we can measure at very early ages, that what we see is that these children, same people now, are actually contributing to things, same group, high percentage of expenditure on social welfare, the 66% of all the welfare cases in New Zealand, 77% of the fatherless children. If you look at things like prescription refills, smoking, crime, and so forth. So we know that fairly early on, we can start to identify people who are at risk for these factors. And I'll show you what happens when we target these people at an early age. On the other hand, for people who are with better environments, early environments, we can see that if we look at these same measures of social problems and social pathologies, there's much less activity. So there really is a sense that we can target these things. Age 3 is the standard that they talk about, but actually we can go back much earlier. And there's huge body of work. I don't want to just say it's Caspi and Moffat and Belsky, whose book I'm drawing from, but there are many other studies of this type. And another factor that we have learned is if you look at lifetime earnings. See, many people think that IQ is very important. I know Singapore had as its credo for many years the idea that high IQ people were the ones to invest in. So if you ask the question using US lifetime data, you can say, well, first of all, 50% of inequality in lifetime earnings is due to factors that are in place at 18. Now, that's a whole variety of factors. And if you single out IQ as the factor, it explains about 5% of the variance. So there are many other things that are very important. These social and emotional skills that we typically dismiss as being unimportant, we have a growing awareness of this. And there's a large body of work being done in economics precisely on trying to measure these so-called soft skills. So skills are much more than what we get out of scores on achievement tests, more than years of schooling. And this notion of executive function I talked about earlier has received a lot of prominence, precisely because it has to do with self-control and, at the same time, the ability to deal with complexity. So we have now developed a series of tests and screens that allow us to think about how children can think about problems, not one at a time. So when we think about when we address a problem, successful solution of the problem is not simply being able to say, okay, I remember Newton's law, or I remember Einstein's E equals mc squared or something. What it requires is getting a sense of the problem, getting a sense of the whole, and breaking the problem down into resolvable components. And that's what executive functioning is measuring, that kind of ability to function in an effective way. So the Educational Testing Service, the very same group that actually has developed things like the SAT and a lot of these standard tests, has been doing a lot of work exactly in trying to develop tests, even specialized tests, for trying to understand how well individuals can be in examining the scope of a problem and then addressing it. So it's many factors, but that involves understanding the problem, so in some matters of intelligence, but then acting on it and being able to understand how to act on it. So what we've come to understand is a whole variety of skills we've come to understand, and I'll just give you that there's a huge body of work that shows this is very, very important, and we have data on each one of these skills. So it's not just something we draw out of a list in psychology, but we have counterparts looking at employment, wages, productivity, and a number of other aspects of life achievement. And what we can also understand is that these skills are amazingly productive in predicting crime, earnings, health, healthy behaviors, educational attainment, teenage pregnancy, and trust. Now, when you see this, and you see these skills, there's an immediate temptation to say, we want to teach people executive functioning. We want to teach people, some say IQ, boost their IQ, or teach people these things. But what we've come to understand is that certain kinds of learning environments stimulate a whole variety of these. And it's not like a program that's targeted individually to each program. It's an environment that turns out to be able to produce effects across the spectrum of this. So let me give you some idea. This is again, this is old data, and many of you may have seen this. There's a recent study of this by Fernald at Stanford, but it's been replicated many, many times. So without going into the details of this table, the essence is that if you look at the verbal environment that children are experiencing, so like in a typical hour, children of a poor family with welfare status in this table will hear about 600 words an hour. Professional children of professionals will hear about 2,000 words. So each hour, there's a verbal bath. And you ask, does that make any difference? Yes, it does. And actually, if you look at some of the work that's being done in France, at the Collège de France, by Dahan, the two Dahans actually, showing literally that these verbal environments have an enormously important role in creating the wiring in the brain, creating synapses, and creating the networks that essentially engage thinking and memory at the same time. So these environments are more important. So this is kind of background. This is a fact that we look at. This is not experimental. You could argue, well, there may be other factors. But what I will say, that if you look, for example, at these early environments to kind of show why I'm worried about this in the Chinese context, that there really are substantial differences in parental involvement. Parenting plays a huge role. Now, part of it is simply the parents aren't there. The parents are working. And so they're, the mothers are away and so forth. So it's not a castigation of any of children, of parents in rural environments. The parents simply aren't there. The counterpart in the US is broken families, and we get similar kinds of results. But the thing that's interesting, that I find very interesting and somewhat disturbing, the early years turn out to be very important in creating these skills. But if you look at the pattern of living arrangements, and I'm told this is a traditional pattern of Chinese parenting, that actually if you look at this graph, and actually the next one as well, that what you'll see, but this one is maybe, oops, I'm going back. Oops, oh, I'm not going back. Here I am. That what you see then is that literally there's more parental presence in the later years than in the early years. Precisely opposite to what we see in terms of the productivity in building child skills. And so I don't know whether it's a cultural practice that's enshrined, but I'm told we certainly see it in the data. Looking at the data in the Mianzhu, we see much more. The children get older, the parents actually enter the lives of children at that point. But the view is that the early years aren't so important. So we see a lot of differences. And so there are gaps. And these gaps, these things make a difference. But I do want to argue that when we think about poverty, and this is again something that's highly relevant, I think, for thinking about child poverty. In the US, we have a lot of discussion about child poverty, and it's usually about the amount of money the child has. But what we really know from the developmental perspective, it's the nature of the child's environment, not the amount of money. Now, the amount of money can change that, can alter that, can affect it, but it's not the whole story. So I'm going to give you some idea. Maybe it's too much. I don't know how much time I have left, but I want to try 15 minutes? Okay, good. So I want to give two ideas here. And these are all formalized. There are some econometric models where we had a paper published at Econometrica a while back that won one of the prizes that was mentioned. But what we can argue is something that we think we know intuitively. Namely, if you ask, who are the best investments in people going to college? Generally, it's the more bright children, the more motivated children. And so that taken by itself would possibly justify a policy of social Darwinism, especially if you start bringing in the notion that IQ is genetically determined, which I want to dissuade you of before this talk is over. So that's one idea that's out there. So it's called static complementarity and so forth. But the question is, do we take this literally? Should we then only invest, like Lee Kwan was doing in Singapore, only in the high IQ children? The answer is no. And why? Because of something we've learned a lot about skill formation, something we call dynamic complementarity. And that is, we've learned about the skill formation process, that if we take even very disadvantaged children and we build their base at early years, we create the opportunity for them to exploit the advantages that occur later on. And so this leads to a very high level of productivity, because the benefit is not just in the current investment, it's the ability for them to take advantage of everything that life offers down the line. And so this dynamic complementarity is at work, and we have a lot of evidence that it works. I could give a long technical talk. We have a lot of evidence on some children in Gansu about this, but I won't go into that. But this dynamics of skill formation, we can formalize this in models of, state-space models and so forth. But today, I'll just look very descriptively. These skills interact, and they interact. We find cross-productivity effects. Healthier children are better able to learn. Brighter children turn out to lead to better lives in terms of health. More motivated children. And the social and emotional skills play very important roles. But these are developing in a dynamic context. So if we wrote down a formal equation, which I won't show for you today, we just have a vector of skills today with investments today producing the vector of skills tomorrow. And so that dynamism is actually very well captured in this process. So what we see then, and this is a program that, this is a curve which I have to be careful in understanding, making sure you understand, that early investments play a very crucial role. So this graph is not based directly on data. It's a distillation of data. But what it's based on is this dynamic complementarity. And what it gives you is a thought experiment where you imagine taking the first RMB and deciding where in the life of the child should we invest it. Suppose we just play that role, play God. Am I going to do it early versus late? Well, if you invest it early, what you're getting is all the subsequent benefits that productivity raises down the line. So these children who are even initially disadvantaged can become very well capable of catching up, or doing partly catching up, not necessarily fully, but catching up a lot. And so these early investments play a very important role. So instead of the Darwinian policy investing only in the bright, we should realize we can create the bright. That's a policy that's really very important. We think about IQ as a genetic trait, and there is a genetic component. When the polygenic scores have been estimated, we see a very important component. But we also know that there's a very powerful role. I'll try to show you some evidence. So let me, since I'm slowly running out of time, or rapidly, I guess, let me show you some evidence, though, to give you something and this is some evidence around the world, including China. So I'm going to do some studies that have been conducted here in China, and some studies that have been conducted in other countries in the US as well. So one of the classic projects that started 60 years ago now, this is a Perry preschool project that was conducted in a town just outside of Detroit, Ypsilanti. It's where, if you know anything about World War II production sites, Willow Run was actually located. So it made a lot of aircraft, and it was used in the, but that's not so important. It turns out to be an area now that's highly disadvantaged. And so a group of people, very smart people, these are psychologists primarily, had this intuition that we should really start investing in early years. And so what they did is they created a kind of investment, but they didn't think of schooling. They're thinking about learning. There's a really important difference, and especially at the early years. You want to think actively about engaging the child in a learning environment. So what did that consist of? Children were, age 3 when they came in. They're mostly disadvantaged, all disadvantaged children actually. These children were given a curriculum. They were given tasks to do each week. Plan a task, do a task, and review the task. The review was collective. The doing and the planning was individual. And they were guided. And on top of that, there were measurements of children at home and so forth, visits by people at home. And if you look at this project, the initial estimates from the first round effects, there was actually a rate of return that was like 10% per dollar invested. And this is a real turn. I mean, this really gets rid of all, it's inclusive of the deadweight cost of collecting taxes to finance these programs. It's really getting rid of all of the usual program cost, the cost of government revenue. So this is a very high rate of return. And this is now measured over the life of the children. And it turns out these children were evaluated by a randomized trial early on in their lives. And this is, in 1960s. We still have the data on those children. And not only do we have the data on the children, we have the data on the children of the children. So we can actually see what the cohorts are. And we can also look at the siblings of the children who are in this project. So we can see benefits that not only go across generations, but across the family, the other children in the family, even those who didn't get the direct intervention. So I'll just show you some idea. If you look at the original Perry participants, they all, the children themselves do extremely well. This is they're only in their 20s when we collected this data, some of them are in the 30s, but mostly 20s. But we can see that across a number of dimensions, these children are doing well. And what we're seeing is a big impact. And what's going on, and this is especially important in an American context, was that these families were typically separated. There was much less, the participants who were in these programs, the male participants especially, were much more likely to form families and to provide environments for their own children that essentially encouraged them. So there's a lot of ways. There was more marriage, there was more earnings, there was much less crime. And remember, this program wasn't targeting crime. This program was not targeting health. It wasn't targeting any particular thing. What it was doing was promoting this interaction pattern between the parent and the child, encouraging the child to learn. The term that psychologists use is a Russian psychologist named Vygotsky who coined the term scaffolding, which is a good term. Think about a building. You're literally going to build, take the child where the child is, and then develop the next way. And that's actually some work that we're doing here now in China, and very much in the group over in Shenzhen. We're actually developing some technology to monitor in a much more refined way how this scaffolding is occurring. This process of parent-child interaction is extremely critical. We know it's critical, but it hasn't really been measured very well, and we think the AI developments will really allow us to think about it in a much more constructive way than has been done in the past. The thing that's true about this program is effective through age 60. I didn't show you all the numbers, but we're getting, so these children, there's another program called ABC, which is much more intensive. It was done 10 years later. We followed these children into the 40s. Again, a randomized trial, treatment and control, and we look at the behavior. And so we can look at the effects on things like higher educational attainment, reduced criminal activity, and so forth and so on. But I mentioned the effects on health. Now remember, this is not a health intervention. This is a parenting intervention. This is an intervention where you're interacting with the child. And so what are you doing? Well, if you look at this is amazing to me. We published this in Science about 10 years ago now, but in the early waves. We have later waves of this same data. But if you look, for example, at things like blood pressure, If you look at things, for example, in hypertension, you look at cholesterol, and you look at some metabolic syndrome as a precursor to diabetes, you can see that the children in the treatment group are much healthier. And there wasn't a health intervention. What happened is their skills were boosted. They were more highly educated, they were more actively engaged, they were more informed, and it was engaging this kind of what I would call executive functioning skills that engages the person himself or herself in creating a return. And when we look at the full effects, in the early Perry study, we didn't have measures of health, but we teamed up with a group at USC in California, and we got some health return data. We were able to then show that the rate of return for this particular study overall, male and female, was close to 14%, 13.7% per annum. And that's including this whole variety of costs. And one of the biggest components was reduction in crime. And that was not intended. It wasn't what it turned out, and this is one of the many findings that should guide the way we think about education policy. But it turns out the same Terry Moffat, whose work I cited, gave a very, very rich study and showed that the onset of criminal activity is in 2 stages. Very early life, like kids 3 to 4, and then into teenage years. So there are 2 different cycles connected with, the different kinds of skills that are being developed. And it turned out the Perry program was developed long in advance of her finding, but it turned out to target exactly those children 3 to 4. And the return was great in reducing crime. Same is true in ABC. So that's the notion, and we can see huge effects in terms of if you just do a pure benefit cost analysis. But if you look at these components, you can see that there are substantial gains here. But not only do we see effects on the children themselves, but the children of the children. So I won't beat this to death, I've already told you that. Especially important in the US context on the male participants and the male children of the male participants. These are African American children, a lot of fatherless children, and this compensates for that. So what is the mechanism that underlies this? Well, I would want to argue, and we've learned to discover this, and this is where the work in Shenzhen will actually stimulate and build, give it a deeper understanding of this. Namely, the parent-child interaction patterns. We have various ways to measure it, and we have measured it. The psychologists try to capture it, the various ways of observing parent-child interactions and so forth. We think we have better ways, so I won't beat you to death, but both in Perry and ABC, there was an improvement. But to my way of thinking, one of the most interesting things in terms about social mobility is this graph. What it shows, and this is the Perry group now, if you look at the line that's solid, the dark line, and just look under education for males, that is the correlation between the children of the control group and the original parents of the control group. There's a very high level of education. It's low, very high correlation, I should say. Very, very high correlation. If you ask the same question about the children of the treatment group, look, it's 0. It's broken. The intergenerational link is broken. Same thing is true of crime. So criminal participants, and remember, this is severely disadvantaged, less pronounced for women, but it's still there. So, and if I have a few more minutes, or should I stop? Well, I'll get to rural China. Since I started with it, I should at least finish with it. Now, the problem with these programs from a practical point of view is they're very costly. I mean, these are programs like ABC is costing $20,000 US per year, $20. So if you have 5 years of that program, it's $100,000. Now, we had you might call it a trial of Paris at Chicago a few years ago. Lou Mai and his group came, where we tried to consider different programs that would be adaptable, well adapted to the situation of children in rural China. So we had the ABC program was represented, and we had other programs as well. But we also had a group of people who came from Jamaica, and I'll talk about the Jamaican program. This is a very iconic program. I know Lou Mai doesn't like to talk about Jamaica. He says, too small a country, China won't get. I promise you, this is a prototype. This is an experiment. We're learning. And in fact, I'll show you something we're learning about the commonality of the development process across these countries. So what's the essential component? So the one way to get at the question of these programs like ABC and Perry and so forth, many of the Head Start, they all have many different features. But we can say, how can we isolate what's the most essential feature? So Jamaica allows us to start that. Because what did Jamaica do? Jamaica focused only on parenting and in a very limited way. And so this program, and we worked with these people, and in fact, they helped design the program for rural China, which I'll describe in a minute. But literally, the Jamaican study gave us a prototype for what could be done. It was launched in the 80s, again evaluated by an experiment. It was low cost and effective. So instead of having the elaborate apparatus of you can see, if you look at these various preschool programs and you read up on them, you'll realize these are very competitive groups of people. They're all trying to get business. And so they'll say, we need to do this, like Nurse Family Partnership says, people must be trained in Denver and wear white uniforms and go on, which seems crazy from an extreme. But we find that it is crazy, actually, because we actually look at something like Jamaica. What did Jamaica do? Jamaica didn't even have a school. It had a 1-hour visit every 2 weeks, a fortnight, in Jamaica. And what it did is it was a visit to the parents. It wasn't even a visit with the children. The children were present, but the main focus was, and what did they teach the parents? How to play with the children, what games would be effective. So 1 hour a week, and they did this for a couple of years, and it turned out, and I'll show you how effective it was, amazing. So this is dirt cheap. It turns out it's about 5% of the cost of these other programs. If you look at what the version in China is compared to the more elaborate programs. What we've done, and I'm actually not only analyzing Chinese data, I'm also in the middle of analyzing Jamaican data. So again, because I see the Jamaican data as providing what I think will be a long-run profile for what the Chinese programs will do. So I see this as a process of putting together different data sets. So we have a group working on the Jamaican data as well. So just to look at these groups, remember 1 hour a week with the parents, and the visitors were not highly educated. They were as educated as the people whose homes they were visiting. They were typically less than high school graduates. They were not. We had a version of this where we went out to rural China, went to Tibet actually, and in one case we visited a program where the people who were visitors were people who were basically middle school graduates, maybe early high school, not full. But they were trained by more sophisticated people. And what they did is they were training the parents in ways to think about interacting with their children. So if we see, how did the prototype do at age 30? We have data on these people to age 30, 35 now actually. And we're analyzing the data, but I'll just show you treatment effects. We're doing much more sophisticated analyses. But if you look at wages, you look at a number of outcomes that we normally think are important, we can see that huge effect. Look at IQ. So remember, a lot of people say it's formed at birth. It's genetic. That was the whole model of the eugenics movement 20 or 30 years ago. And in fact, we do see that big differences between the treatment and the control IQ. And these are lasting at age 30. This is not something that's just found a few months after the program, like most of these studies are done. And if we look at some of these other psychological measures, which I tried to convince you were very important, things like extroversion and so forth, emotional stability, and I didn't include in this table and should have the executive functioning skill. But if we go back, let me go back, sorry. I gotta learn this. If we look at what the children are doing now, these are Jamaican children, treatment and control, you can see many more of these kids went to college, got a high school college diploma. They certainly attended higher years of schooling, and they attended college at a higher rate. So there's a tremendous growth. So that's very promising. Now, there's a version similar to this program that was developed in Ireland. This is a program that I've been working with. I had an arrangement in Ireland for a while. I think it was mentioned I was a lifetime member of the Irish Economic Society. That's how this arose. So from my Irish days. But the person behind this is Orla Doyle, not me. And I worked with her, and her findings are very interesting. She has a version of Jamaica. Again, low-cost program, visiting parents. So by any measure, it's a very low cost. Not exactly the same as Jamaica, but it had to do with this notion of engaging the parents in the life of the child. And then now we have very interesting data. So we can look at children who are at school age, at age of school entry. We can see real benefits. And more recently, in a paper she published in the Journal of Political Economy, Orla has shown lasting effects through age 10. And she has a new study that she's doing through age 13. So what she's found is similar benefits to what the Jamaican study found. So just to come to the final statement here, so what did we do? Well, we had this trial of Paris, if you want to call it that. We had a group of these different people advocating their programs about how they might be able to help rural Chinese children. So this is the Lu Mai group at the China Development Research Foundation. And we also worked with Beijing Normal University. And so what we did is actually built this criterion. And we built this program, and they had the original Jamaican creators come to China and adapt the curriculum to a Chinese context. So literally, the founders were there. This is almost one for one. So which was very nice scientifically, because we can also look at the growth profiles of the Chinese children, the Jamaican children, the Irish children. There are a number of other children as well, but I won't go through all. I'll show you some. So what we did is we had these weekly visits, 1 hour per week. It's more intensive than the Jamaican program. Kids were given supplements, but that's treatment and control. It's not playing a major role, because some of these are nutritionally deficient. And we have a lot of sites that we've actually started these programs in. Most actively, we've had this group in Gansu, in this province in Gansu, but we also have a program in Bijie in southern China, and as I mentioned, we set up this program in rural Tibet. And there's a program to go at least the northern part of Xinjiang. So eventually I'll visit the nomads with Lu Mai in northern Xinjiang. So what do we find? Okay. So the one thing we did is said, okay, we have data on the Jamaican children. We have data on the Chinese children. We have data on the Irish children. We have data on a variety of different children, all with roughly the same program. So we have some methodologies, and I won't go through those methodologies, but I think they give us the ability to compute things like the language and cognitive skills of the children, the treatment and control. And if you look at the solid line, these are the distribution functions. So what you can see is these things are shifted to the right. And so what you're getting is that these children are getting higher levels, the treated children are getting higher levels of cognition and higher levels of language skill. And we follow these children. They're still very early in the days of the children. So this is, for example, but we can also compare how the Chinese children are doing with the Jamaican children, because we have the Jamaican data. So we can then literally do it to see to what extent are the Chinese children keeping on track. And they are. You can see these studies, not exactly the same measures. Populations are different. Measures are a little different, actually, but nonetheless, they are pretty comparable. And so what we did is started looking at a growth curve. And we literally are just plotting how are the treated children. So if you look at the Chinese treatment group and the Jamaican treatment group, you can see they overlap pretty consistently. They're on the same growth trajectory. And now we have the data on the Chinese children at age 9. We haven't analyzed those yet, so I can't show you the graph, but we have plans to do that. So let me just conclude. I think we can go on for many years, and I don't want to bore you further, but one thing we did find, and I think it's very important, I sometimes like to compare this study to what Madame Curie was doing with radium. That's a little pretentious, I realize, but we have all these omnibus programs. They do many different things. You know, they take the kid out, they do this, they teach that, and so forth and so on. But most of these programs have a component of building parent-child interaction. So when we look at programs that only focus on parent-child interaction, we use the home visiting programs, and we compare them at comparable ages with comparable measures, we can see that the home visiting programs and the standardized programs are pretty much similar to each other. You have to look at the ages. Perry and ABC I talked about. Our home visiting programs are really quite dramatic. You can see that we're on target. This is amazing. These programs are about 1/20th of the cost of these more advanced programs. Those are the advanced programs receive the most attention in the literature. But I think this is really hopeful for China and for the rest of the world. In fact, we're implementing a program in Chicago. It's taking the Jamaican and Irish program, taking it to back of the yards in Chicago, which is a disadvantaged program. But now you can see that these programs are on track, building non-cognitive skills, reading skills, and so forth and so on. So they're comparability, math skills, and so forth. So when you look at outcomes, now, of course, the Chinese program, the kids are too young. But if you look at the Jamaican program and compare that program with these more involved omnibus programs, we're getting very similar measures in terms of outcomes. Once we use comparable measures, once we get comparable ages. So I could go on, but I'll stop at this because we could talk more about how to improve schools. But I think there's something very hopeful here. It's not only a scientific program for how to develop skills, and we have a long way to go when we have this meeting in UNESCO last September. And you can see that some of the neuroscience is really telling us a lot about what skills develop and when and how we might change the nature of education. But this is very promising in the sense that at least one aspect of the rural poverty can be supplemented, and we can address it in a very effective way. And since it's low cost and it's effective and it's really giving, I think, possibility of intergenerational mobility that's not present to the same extent. So it's true in Jamaica, it's true in Ireland, I think it's going to be true in China as well. So, okay, well, thank you very much. I went on too long.
Thank you, Professor Heckman, for the very inspiring lecture. Please remain on the stage for the Q&A session.
So we have 5-10 minutes for Q&A. So we are now entertaining questions from the audience. So if you have questions, please raise your hand and identify yourself. So the girl.
Okay, so my first question is that for China, as you mentioned, there are a lot of parents who are migrant and there are a lot of children who are left behind. So these home visiting programs, they go to do home visiting like Channel Reach, but their parents are not there.
Right.
So how
But
can
the grandparents are frequently there.
Oh, so it's like grandparents, their interactions
Yes, but
with
one
their.
thing we found,
but-
no, but you're right on target,
Yeah.
because what happens is that the grandparents are much worse. In terms of taking these same programs, you would train the grandparent in the same way, give them the same lesson. But what's interesting, and we have to figure out what's going on, so this is something in process. Namely, there's a big gap between the visitor's education, typically like middle school or high school, versus the 3 years of education of many of the grandparents. So it creates a cultural gap. And so the grandparents are less effective. And I think part of it is this gap. We see a comparable gap in the US between children. If you visit homes with sort of highly educated visitors and then less educated parents or child takers, child givers, caregivers, those are less effective, but there's a mismatch. So that's a dimension we're looking at. But you're absolutely right. I mean, you're getting right at the point, which is that a lot of these grandparents would not be as effective. And we find lower effects of the program. Exactly.
I see.
Which means it has to be calibrated in that way. That was something new that we hadn't thought of before, but it's a finding we've done, for sure.
Yeah, and also it's like I feel like that there might be a large difference across regions for this China Reach program to carry out, like in Tibet and maybe in Sichuan. It might be very different because it's like when I do an internship at CDRF, I read some materials that are written by those home visitors.
Yes.
And I feel like
Good.
and it's like when I read those home visitors who are from Tibet, I feel like they basically could not write coherent Mandarin. It's like, I feel like...
Well, they're Tibetans, though.
yeah, so it's like there is a
I
large
think they
gap.
speak good Tibetan, but I'm not the right judge of that. So
Yeah, so it's like I feel like this program may be very hard to implement in those very poor rural
No,
areas
but we
in
saw
China.
there, I mentioned, we went out west of Lhasa, like 100 kilometers or so, out in the
Yeah.
countryside. It was very traditional Chinese, I mean, Tibetan, I guess. There was this courtyard, it was more like Pearl Buck, the good earth. And there was this compound, and down in the compound was a yak or two grazing, And the mother was there, and the grandparents were there, and the child was there. The child was delighted when the home visitor came. And so there was a positive interaction. That hasn't been evaluated yet, so I don't know. But I mean, there are some cultural inconsistencies. Like in Bijay, you had the Hmong, or much more, they had very different kinds of approaches. It turns out in Tibet, there's a lot of emphasis on dancing. Dancing is very much more common than it was, for example, in Gansu. So they danced. They taught the parents how to dance
So
with the
maybe
child.
in the interest of time, perhaps
I
we
see. Thank you so
allow
much.
for one more question.
No, I'd like to hear your stories about that. I'm around for a while.
Larry.
so-
Thank you very much, Jim. That's a very interesting talk. We wish we had more time.
Well, I'm around for a while, so I'll keep talking each hour, so.
But I actually was quite interested to see that you have prenatal
Yes,
education.
Yes.
Because, the Chinese have always believed in taijiao, prenatal. We have always believed in that. When a woman becomes pregnant, you begin to think about how you can educate
right, no, but in
the
terms of
unborn
prenatal
child.
environment, it's critical.
So that is actually quite common. I just saw it.
Yeah,
a
no, but
little
you
bit,
see, for example, in prenatal environments where children are being, the mothers in
right.
starvation, and the nutrients are reduced substantially.
yeah.
That has last time effect. You've heard about this Dutch hunger winter study?
Yeah.
Yeah, see, that's from the 1940s. This group of kids
Right.
born in Holland during the time the Germans were still occupying it and the starvation was high.
Yeah.
Those kids have never done as well.
Yeah.
There's other kids
No.
in part of Holland that never had the.
But in the Chinese case, it goes beyond nutrition. Of course, you're right.
Yeah,
about
no,
nutrition,
right.
But it goes
How
beyond
the mother
nutrition.
takes care of herself.
Yeah.
Smoking would be another threat.
Yeah,
Drinking.
goes beyond. Yeah. But I actually have a question in the following sense. If you actually look at your study, the results of the children, the intervention works not only on the children, right, but also on the children of children.
Exactly.
Right. But if you really think about it, I wonder whether that's the right way to think about it. Because the only cost is the beginning, right? And then the benefits, in principle, can be infinite, right? I mean, yeah, it goes
I
on.
argue you might want to accelerate that, but you're absolutely right. And if dynamic complementarity plays any role,
Yeah.
then you could accelerate their development by
That's
having
right.
additional.
Yeah. But the
Yes,
return should be
for
much higher than what you said.
Yeah,
right?
no, there's
okay.
the real dynamic benefits.
Yeah, right.
And the spillover with the siblings is real.
Yeah.
Very important
Because,
Europe.
what is amazing is that it didn't seem to change very much
No,
from generation to generation. I mean, that is really amazing.
it is interesting.
Yeah.
So you're building children and
Yeah.
but what's happening, at least in the Perry study, that is the one we know the most. We've been invested heavily in Perry over the years. The changing the home environment. And notice I raced through this. Where was the home environment improved? If you start looking at age 40 or 45, the treated men were more likely to be married than with their original spouse than the control. But during the period of childbearing and child rearing, they were much more likely.
I see.
So the home was intact, and there were more resources built into the home. So that's what propelled it forward. It's just going to reinforces the idea those early years are important.
Yep. Thank you.
But there's a lot more to be done. I mentioned the knowledge about teaching Chinese. The one thing we know, and this is a common fact, but this guy Dahan has done some amazing work. Learning language skills, it varies. We know all now that by age 10 or 11, the way the brains form, on average, is that the older you learn a language, certainly past 11 or 12, the more difficult it is to pick the language up without an accent. But, I mean, at least in America, a lot of the languages are only taught after age 11. So it's precisely the worst kind of strategy. And also, if you looked at the way that in the Mianzhu study I showed you briefly, the parents who are leaving and coming back are coming back later in the life of the child rather than earlier, where they had the biggest impact. So there are some design features you might think about policy that would actually restructure that kind of activity.
Because of time constraint, we have to conclude the lecture here. So please join me to thank Professor Heckman again.
Okay, so this concludes today's lecture. On behalf of the organizers, I would like to thank you all for coming.